In my game design career, I've created and tested hundreds of games, both of my own and also playtesting the games of other designers. And over time you build up a list of common tips that you give designers to improve their games, and tips that I've learned to use in my own designs as well. In this video I want to give you some direct practical tips for how to improve your game designs and hopefully increase their chances of being published. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world. On this channel, I like to talk about all things game design, from my career in the industry to tips and tricks to helping newer designers improve their craft. Think of this list as a toolbox of tips and tricks that you can turn to when you're having problems in your own designs. Choose whichever one might make sense at the particular time, and don't worry about trying to use all of them at once. Some of them will be more applicable to certain games than others. So let's get started. Remove unnecessary phases. Especially when you're designing more complex games, you can end up having a lot of different actions that a player has to take on their turn. And sometimes, to simplify it, you'll separate out these actions into different phases, such as I have to start my turn by drawing a card, then I take some resources, then I take 2 actions, and then maybe I do some steps at the end of my turn, discard some cards, reset something about my tableau. Invariably though, the more phases you have, not only does the game become more difficult to teach because there's simply more things that you're doing, the turns become much longer and overall the game is longer than it maybe needs to be. I've found something really useful in my own designs is to remove phases that are just not necessary, or instead think about a different way to structure the game so that you can reduce the number of phases. In one of my most recent designs, Builders of Baldur's Gate, there are 3 types of actions a player can do on their turn. They can build a building, they can take a special action out on the game board, or they can take income. Now, a traditional way of thinking about these type of Euro-style games would be that you would do all 3 on your turn. Maybe you would start by building a building, then you'd be able to put a worker out on the board, and at the end of the turn you would take some income. But instead of having every turn have 3 phases and therefore be much more longer and complex, I set up the game differently. Instead, I let you do whatever you want on your turn, but you're only going to do one of those 3 actions. So it's your choice. You can gain income every turn if you want, but that's the only thing you could do. You could build a building every single turn, but that's the only thing you would do. You have the same variety of actions and the same richness and complexity that comes from choosing the right action at the right time, but you're effectively cutting turn times by a third because you're only doing one of 3 things. And this is just one example of removing phases from a player's turn to make the game simpler to play and quicker. Use entwined decisions. Seth Jaffe is a fantastic board game designer, best known for games like Eminent Domain, and I believe he was the first one to coin this term on his blog. The idea of entwined decisions is combining 2 areas where a player is going to make a decision about and putting them into one choice that they make on their turn. A very simple idea is in Domino, where when you choose what tile you're going to take in a future round, you're choosing 2 things really. You're choosing the actual tile that you want, but also you're choosing in which order you're going to go in the future round. Entwined decisions refers to the fact that one decision can determine 2 or more outcomes. I've used the idea of entwined decisions in a lot of my games. From games like Pyramids, where the god tiles that you draft every round tell you the order in which you're going to take new cards for the turn, but also where you can play those cards to the specialists in Chocolate Factory, where when you take a specialist, it tells you both a special power you get to take and which department store you're going to be able to fulfill chocolates to in that turn. So that one choice of which specialist you take determines 2 things. Using entwined decisions in this way has several benefits. Often it makes a game shorter and easier to play, because instead of making several different decisions about different aspects of the game, one after another, you just make one choice, and that choice determines a number of different aspects all at once. It also can create a lot of strategic depth without adding complexity to the rules. And this is something we might call elegance in game design. You can have 2 disparate pools of things that you're choosing from, but the moment that you link them up into a single choice means you have to weigh them up against each other. I might be taking a really great tile, but I'm going to have a really poor turn order in the next round. Once you know about entwined decisions, you see them everywhere in games, and there's a reason that they're very popular. And they're a great tool to think about using in your own designs. Remove unnecessary choices. Do you ever get the feeling when you play a game that sometimes you have to make choices that you don't really care about or don't seem to matter very much, but because you want to play well at the game, you end up taking a lot of time thinking about them anyway? These are what I would call unnecessary decisions, and you should try and get rid of them in your game if possible. I define unnecessary decisions as decisions which take up more time for a player than what they're worth strategically. They're those actions a player, especially one who's prone to analysis paralysis, will take minutes agonizing over, which ultimately have little or no effect over the result of the game. Some common places you tend to see them are at the very start of a game, where a player has to make a choice such as what card they want to start with or what character they're going to be, and they have to try and make this choice when they maybe don't have a lot of information about how the game plays, or about other things that are going to reveal themselves as you keep playing the game. And this is especially a problem if it's that player's first game. And this is why often in games you might have a first play setup, where instead of choosing what you start with, you simply randomly deal them out to players, or give them set starter packs, such as in Race for the Galaxy, which gives you a starting planet and 4 cards of your starting hand that work well together. Another place where unnecessary decisions can step in are where you have to make a choice about something which is going to influence your opponent, but in a very minor way. One example is I sometimes see in prototypes where a player is asked to discard some cards from an available tableau of cards, and the only reason to care about this choice is to care about what another player might want or not want on a future turn. Often in most games this is an easy thing to cut, because it's not adding much to the strategic depth of the game. It often is actually quite a difficult choice for the player to make, because it requires them to look at the play states of multiple opponents, try and work out what they're doing, and then apply that to the choice at hand. And in reality, the game is probably better if you just don't have to make a choice at all, and you make it automatic, such as the rightmost 2 cards are discarded. If you find your players agonizing over too many choices and then making the game really long, try and really think about, are all these choices necessary, or could some of them be automated to make the game flow a lot more smoothly, and the players wouldn't feel like they're giving up much agency at all. Give a player fewer options on their turn. Sometimes it can be hard to improve a game if a player is overwhelmed with the number of choices they're going to make on their turn, or that they have to choose one from so many different options. What you're looking for is an optimal number of choices that a player is choosing from on their turn. Too small and the decision is obvious, and it feels like the game is playing itself. Too many, and either the player will take far too long trying to choose between different options, or you'll end up having multiple options which are both roughly as good as each other, and then it becomes almost meaningless to choose between 2 equally good options. It might sound a bit strange, but I find 3 is a really good number in game design when thinking about things to choose from. Often when you have 3 things to choose from, you can usually discard one pretty quickly because it's worse than the other 2, and then you're making a simple choice between 2 things. And that can often be quite satisfying, easy to navigate, and lead to smoother gameplay. For example, when we were developing Tree Society, the building display used to be a choice from 6 buildings, but during development we realized that we could put those buildings into 2 rows, the first row being cheaper than the other. And while this doesn't necessarily reduce the number of choices a player has when they're trying to determine what to build, it does help guide their decisions. It effectively does reduce their decisions because they're going to usually look at that first row that's cheaper first. And only if there isn't anything good in that first row will they then look at the second row and make a decision there. And it didn't really take away any of their strategic freedom. Use effective iconography and color in your prototype. Sometimes it can be hard to tell whether your game is appearing more complicated because of how it plays or how it's presented to the players. Thinking about effective iconography and the effective use of color in your prototype can have a transformative effect on how it's received by players. There are lots of great websites which have libraries of great icons that you can use in your game, from Flat Icon to the Noun Project to GameIcons.net, all of which are free to use, and they offer such a huge selection of icons that you're bound to find a set that will be exactly what you need in your game. Once you have those icons, I would recommend using different colors for each of those icons as well, because then you're effectively double encoding the information. You're using both the shape of the icon and the color to convey information to the player as to what that icon is. Some players will find it much easier to be able to tell between icons by color, and other players, especially colorblind players, will find it easier to distinguish them by shape. But by having both, you're serving both those players while taking up exactly the same amount of space on the card or board. Thinking a little bit about iconography when you start your game design project can make a huge difference, and using this tip can be especially useful at the start when it can be really hard to work out if your game is working at all. If you do your best to try and remove sources of confusion which can cloud your judgment about the quality of the game, then you're more likely to be able to work out what's fun about the game earlier. Here you can see some images of early prototypes of mine, and you can see while everything else about the design of the prototype is very basic, I've already employed some distinct and clear icons to be able to distinguish certain types of actions and resources from each other. Leverage your specific interests and skills. One way that your game can stand out amongst a sea of other games is by having a really specific theme or view on the world that maybe only you know about or are interested in. Think about things that you're passionate about, maybe things you collect, events that you like to go to, pastimes that you enjoy doing, and perhaps think about using one of those as the subject for a game that you're going to make. Because you're already passionate about that thing, you likely already know a lot more about it than other people, and you're in a much better position to then portray that pastime or thing or hobby in a game accurately and in an interesting way, and furthermore in a way that other players are going to be curious to learn about while playing it. So not only are you likely to make a game where the mechanisms and theme of the game have a great marriage with each other and support each other in a really strong way, but you're also more likely to have a game that's going to stand out from other games because you have a much more specific theme, or even if it's a more common theme, more likely you've been able to put your own spin on it because of your own experiences with that theme in real life. For instance, I've been working on a game about flavour for a long time, and that in part was informed by my own experiences working as a food scientist earlier in my career. And also don't neglect the specific skills that you might have that you could bring to the game design process. You might be a fantastic collaborator, and so thinking about working with other designers or graphic designers in your project might be a really effective way to make a great game. You might be an excellent writer, so maybe think about a game that can incorporate your writing skills. You might be very experienced in 3D printing or other manufacturing methods, and then that might suggest using those kind of components in a game idea. Think about what skills might set you apart from other game designers. That means you're going to be able to make games that employ those specific skills that the other designers can't. And in both cases, if you're working on a project which either features something you love from the rest of your life or employs a skill that you're particularly good at, you're going to be more enthusiastic about working on it, and that will mean it's more likely that you'll finish the game and that it'll be a better game once it's done. Don't ask players to track too much information. Another way a game can often slow down is if you're giving too much information for players to process on their turn in order to make a decision. Some common ways that you see this fixed are scores being hidden, such as in my game The Guild of Merchant Explorers, where a player's score is represented by coins which they keep face down. And this reduces players trying to work out who's winning during the game and tailoring their actions to specifically attack the player in the lead, which might bog the game down. Another case is whether I need to worry about what another player might have in their tableau that might influence what I'm doing. One common thing is majorities. You might have an effect which is determined on you having the most of a particular type of card or animal, and if this majority concerns an element that's visible to all the players, then you're asking a player to potentially recalculate that majority every time they're taking a turn, every time they're taking an action. And this can really slow the game down as well. So you can think about hiding this. For example, if you're worried about how many cards for a particular type of players collected, maybe they could be collecting them face down. And even though players technically could remember all the cards, especially if they were revealed as they were put into the face down pile, in most cases, the moment they're face down, players will stop worrying about them and they'll play the game much more quickly. Another way to shift this is to make these effects things that you only have to worry about at the very end of the game, rather than effects that you constantly have to worry about and activate during the play. It's a very different task to work out who has the most of something just at the end of the game once, than having to calculate it every turn. The latter can really make the game bog down. Give players interesting things to do on other players' turns. Sometimes the best games are ones that feel like a player is immersed in their decision making throughout the whole game, even on other players' turns. And a very simple way to do that is to allow them to start planning what they're going to do on their next turn while other people are playing. Maybe they could be looking at what cards are available and trying to work out which one they're going to take on their turn. Or maybe they're going to work out how they might spend their resources that they already have. This can be a really strong and engaging part of game design, and really improve the experience for players, and reduce the feeling of downtime. But this doesn't work if everything might change the moment before I take my turn, and instead what was previously a positive thing can turn into a headache of analysis paralysis as I quickly have to rethink about what I'm going to do. For instance, if I was talking about working out what card I might take, if the whole card display is refreshed immediately before my turn, then I suddenly have a new 5 or 6 cards to not only have to read and understand, but then choose between. Or if I was thinking about how I was going to spend my resources, if I generate all the resources at the start of my turn, then I might only think about them the moment I generate them, and we're already on my turn and the clock is ticking. So just try and think about how you're managing that information for players, and try and shift it so that they can make meaningful planning decisions on other players' turns. When it comes to a card display, maybe ensure that only 1 or 2 cards are changing turn by turn. So for the most part, a player could have worked out which card they're going to take, and every once in a while they have to make a new decision if the card they wanted was taken right before their turn. But again, it's only one new card that they have to consider from. Or in the case of the resources, maybe make sure that a player generates all their resources at the end of their turn, so that from the end of their turn till their next turn, they have that same pool of resources that they're considering how to use. Another really simple choice in this way is determining when a player will draw new cards into their hand. If a player is going to draw new cards into their hand at the start of their turn, then they have more options on their turn because they're seeing a new card, but then they have to spend time on their turn comprehending that card and working out its value in relation to the other things they could do in their hand. On the flip side, you could have them draw cards at the end of their turn, and then that means they have all the other players' turns to look at their hand and work out their best course of action, ready to immediately employ it on their next turn. There's no one or right choice, but often moving things to the end of a player's turn will make gameplay much quicker and smoother, and allow players to plan effectively and be more immersed in the game. My game Elysium is a great example of this, where players have to choose what card they're going to take on their turn based on what coloured pillars they have still in their play area, and this decreases over time. Because a player knows which pillars they have on their next turn, they have the whole turn cycle to look at the cards available in the middle of the table, know what pillars they have, and then plan what card they're going to take. And even though you start with quite a large pool of cards, up to 13 in a 4-player game, as the turns go on, you can play quicker and quicker because you can plan very effectively as what you can do based on the pillars you have. Other players only take one card at maximum during their turn, and no new cards are added to that central area, so there's not more information that players have to process before it gets to their turn and they can make another choice. Get rid of exceptions. We've all been there when we've been working on a game and something pops up, some edge case of a rule, which requires us to effectively put another rule in the game to cover that edge case. While it might make the game more balanced or work in the way you intended it to, having exceptions like this have several downsides. Firstly, there are simply more rules to learn when playing the game, and often that rule doesn't necessarily make sense with all the other rules because it is literally an exception, so it can be much harder to remember, and it might not come up every time you play the game. And it can sometimes break the flow of the game because you're trying to wonder, why is this rule in the game? It doesn't make any sense with the rest of the way I'm playing. I would really encourage you to try and remove these rules exceptions in your games. They'll be much smoother to play and easier to learn, and that's a real positive thing. Of course, it's easier said than done, and it can sometimes mean you have to rework the whole game, but if that problem you're trying to fix with the rules exception is big enough that you really have to fix it, then it might be worth reconsidering the whole system to make sure you don't need the exception. Of course, this isn't always possible, but in my own experience, in my own designs, I've often found it much more fruitful to be able to reimagine the system without that exception, that it still works, than bolting on exceptions just to fix edge cases. Guide your players' focus. A lot of common feedback that you get when you playtest a game can be related to problems with a player not knowing what to focus on. Imagine you sit down to play a game and there's a board of 100 spaces, and on your first turn you can place a piece on any of those 100 spaces. You would be overwhelmed with the number of choices that you're able to make simply on your first turn, and that's not even thinking what that first choice might influence on other choices you'll make in the game. Now instead, imagine that you're given a starting place on that 100 space board, and then you can only conquer spaces that are adjacent to spaces where you're already at. Instead of then having 100 spaces to worry about, you might have 4 or 5 that you have to worry about on your turn, and it's a much simpler choice to make. A more concrete example of this is in my game The Guild of Merchant Explorers, where you have a map of many different hex spaces, you have a starting space, and you can only place adjacent to it. So actually at the start of the game you have very limited choices of where to go on a turn. This might seem really obvious, but you'd be surprised how many games ask players to consider a lot of things even to take one action. Finding a way to help narrow the focus of a player in making those early decisions will really help them with their analysis paralysis and help them feel like they're making a meaningful choice rather than just randomly choosing something because they can't be bothered to work out all the different options. Then if you move beyond the start of the game and move into the early to the mid stage of the game, using different goals can help players make a meaningful decision as to what they should be focusing on at that stage of the game. Things like goals which players are racing towards to complete, or endgame goals that players might be worried about, are different ways of guiding the focus of players and helping them determine what they should really be worried about. Goals can be helpful guide rails to help players make a good choice, that what they're doing will definitely be rewarded in some way. So, I hope this video has been able to give you a few new tools to add to your game design toolbox, some tips and tricks to help you improve your own game designs. By no means is this list meant to be comprehensive or something that you should follow through for every game you do. As I always say, take what's useful to you and discard the rest. If you have any tips or tricks that you find help you in your own game design, please share them in the comments below, and hopefully that might help someone else improve their own games. But as always, thanks very much for watching, and all the best with your game designs. Bye.